Hey everyone, how are you doing? I'm not, to be honest. For some reason, I'm so freaking nervous right now. My whole body is shaking. I can feel my chest right there. Normally, it starts to go away by now, but today it's just getting worse. So if you want to see someone suffering in pain, you came to the right talk. Hopefully it's going to fade away. Maybe this is the reason why I'm quite nervous today. I might say some things that upset the Church of Domain-Driven Design. I'm going to be talking about, I think it's good to challenge things, right? Nothing's ever perfect. So in this talk, I'm just going to look at some of the aspects of domain-driven design that maybe could be improved, if that's possible to improve anything in domain-driven design. Some people on Twitter might say that's impossible. That's the nerves. If you haven't read the domain-driven design book before, or haven't heard anything about domain-driven design, that's okay. It's a bit of a beginner talk. If you have read it, if you've used it, if you've been applying it for years, maybe you might find it useful as well. So let's just get straight into it. So here's one of the kinds of criticisms that I'll see from time to time about domain-driven design. So what's this guy talking about? Domain-driven design is just awful. Everyone I've ever spoken to that claims to understand it has a different definition that can't be applied by others. Utterly useless. Might as well use tarot cards to derive boundaries from. So, if there's one thing you take away from this conference, tarot card-driven architecture, maybe. Similar comments here. Someone read one of the books, likes the ideas, but getting a bit caught up in all of this domain-driven design terminology, like, bounded context, ubiquitous language. Are we developing software or are we philosophists? What does this terminology mean? Some people take a different approach in the way they provide feedback. We can see Dan Brew and James Morecambe here have been proposing alternative definitions to some domain-driven design terms. They're not being critical. They're just having a bit of a laugh and a joke. But 50% of jokes are true. All of mine are true. So if you're ever doubting, all my jokes are true. But this bounded context word, doesn't always land with people. It's got something to do with language. So James is talking about linguospheres. And then there's a guy called Herman. He wrote about this stuff, and he had a bit of a poke at the phrase ubiquitous language. It's got a very limited space of applicability. That's kind of the opposite of ubiquitous. It would be good to talk to the Church of DDD and get their thoughts on this one, what they mean by ubiquitous exactly. Maybe it's a special kind of ubiquitous. And then we've got Jeremy Miller, who's often at these NDC conferences. He's a bit more direct with his feedback and his opinions of domain-driven design. And he's just talking about every code base he's ever seen that uses it. Add your own word there. So I think people in the domain-driven design community actually know that there's opportunity for improvement. A long time ago, Eric, he was talking about, if he could write the book again, he might do some things differently. Acknowledging that these problems people have with DDD, if he could do it again, he might explain or write the book in a different way so that people didn't have these problems. Maybe, So what he said, this one, he said, he's going to reorder the book to put a different order of preference around certain concepts. So, he put a lot of the strategic stuff at the back around architecture and things. He wants to put that in chapter 2 or 3. So I found this really inspiring. I was thinking about what he was saying here. And I was like, he's got his own alternative DDD timeline. What if I had mine? What if I could have my own alternative DDD timeline? And I looked at all of these things people were saying and criticizing. And I could change history so that they were all saying wonderful things every single time. So I thought, well, he wants to reorder some chapters. maybe we can be a bit more adventurous than that. If we're going to have an alternative timeline and we can do whatever we want in history, what would an ambitious alternative DDD timeline look like? And so I thought, what if we just take one chapter and throw the rest away? Would that be an alternative DDD timeline worth exploring? So that's what I'm going to do in my alternative timeline today. I'm going to talk you through chapter 8 in the book, which is called Breakthrough. And I think this is the hidden treasure, because I really feel like this one chapter, I've read it a lot of times actually. And whenever I read the book, I always feel like, why don't people get this part of DDD? This is what we think of, but then they're all getting trapped around certain words and little patterns in codes. So chapter 8, I think, is the hidden treasure. It's been there all along in the book. So I thought, well, let's put that as the first chapter in the book. And I'm like, well, actually, it's my alternative timeline. Let's just put that at the front and not have any other bits in the book. So Maxime, he likes this chapter too. He calls it the forgotten chapter. So maybe after this talk, go back and check it out. And hopefully, if you've got any concerns around DDD, this might help you connect back with the core concepts and points and what it's all really about. Nerves haven't gone away at all. So I'm going to talk you through the chapter 8 in the book with some of my commentary on top and my observations. So I've split it down into 3 parts. I think there are 3 nice takeaways from this chapter. And the first one is what I'm calling intuitions of a seasoned domain modeler. So the first part of this chapter, really exciting, I think. It really sets the scene in a nice way. It doesn't tell us much about DDD, but he's talking about after a long New York winter of refactoring. Now, I love refactoring, I love winter, and I love New York. So I'm like, is he writing this chapter for me or something? Because I just read that and I can imagine it, going into New York every day, it's dark nights, you're refactoring in this dark outside in the office with your colleagues. It really sets the scene for me, but that's not really part of domain-driven design. The full opening of the chapter, he's talking about after a long New York winter of refactoring, we had arrived at a model that captured some of the key knowledge of the domain and a design that did some real work for the application. We were developing a core part of a large application for managing syndicated loans in an investment bank. So all of those details don't really matter too much. It's just setting the scene for all of the bits that are coming next. So it's important to understand some of these details. And so then, still at the start of the chapter, he starts, this boy can write a story. He knows how to build, get a point across and grab your attention. And he's like, when Intel wants to build $1 billion factory, a bit of name dropping, throwing some big numbers in there, they need a loan that's too big for any single lending company to take on. So the lenders form a syndicate that pools its resources to support a facility. So don't need to worry about all of those details, not critical to the story, but we get the sense here that he's working on this big, interesting project, Intel, $1 billion factories. Something important happening here. We're not doing DDD on a to-do list app in the latest JavaScript framework. It's a bit different. So then we get to this, talking about his team's specific role in this project. So an investment bank usually acts as a syndicate leader, coordinating transactions and other services. Our project was to build software to track and support this whole process. So we can see what they're getting up to, what his role is, what his team's building, software to track that process of managing syndicated loans, big loans. So we now understand what's been happening in that New York winter a bit more deeply. They weren't hanging out at Times Square, just chilling out with their dudes. They're actually really doing some refactoring. So we were feeling pretty good. 4 months before, we had been in trouble with a completely unworkable inherited code base. Who's inherited a code base that wasn't completely unworkable? Let's chat later. I need to verify that first. So whether it's true or not, we always talk about other people's code, but they've inherited this code, they spent all winter refactoring it, and they've got this model, that they're happy with this model. So it's kind of domain-driven design, right? We try and model it, try and create a nice model in the code. But we don't know yet, really, is this model actually useful, or is it just some developers who like perfectionists creating beautiful models in the code? Is there any real value to this, or are they just perfectionists? Let's take on the next step. But there were some disconcerting signs. We kept stumbling over unexpected requirements. I've highlighted that word because, I think no requirement's unexpected, really. But I'll let him have that. That complicated the design. A major example was the creeping understanding that the shares in a facility were only a guideline. So, I spent all winter refactoring, got this nice model, but there's some doubts there. At this point, we don't know. Are they just perfectionists? It needs to be even more perfect. Or is this, relevant to the work they're doing? Is there some consequence of this that's going to affect the projects they're working on? So, I think an important lesson here, which stands out to me, which is relevant on most of the projects, I would say, is you build that first part, you build that happy path, the 80-20 rule, and then you start getting all of these requirements that come up. And it's easy to just think, all these requirements are necessary. But here, what they're noticing is that it feels like the code they're writing is too complex for the requirements they've got. They don't know why. It's kind of like a feeling at this point. There's not much precision in what they're describing. It's just, this doesn't feel right. I'll come back to that shortly. So here, they talk about, we had accommodated this by adding loan adjustments to the model. The concept of loan adjustments isn't key here. Don't worry too much about the domain. But the point is, refinements of this kind allowed us to keep up as the rules of various transactions became clearer. But complexity was increasing, and we did not seem to be converging quickly onto solid functionality. So what they've done here, they're sensing that their model isn't perfect. And they've added this new concept into their model, and it's made it easier to add some of these unexpected requirements, but they're still feeling like it's a bit of a hack. It's not. The code's still getting out of control and becoming too complex. And I think this is where people who are good at domain modeling start to have these feelings about this isn't right, it could be designed better, whereas if you're just looking at requirements and implementing them in code, you might be happy at this point. We've got the requirements, we've written the code. I don't see that this thing's getting out of control and complex. I'm just moving on to the next Jira ticket. So I think what they're getting across at this point is really something that only happens with like expert domain modelers or seasoned domain modelers. It's like something's not right here. We can implement these requirements in code, but it's just not right. And they're starting to question their understanding of the domain itself. Do we not understand the domain we're working in, and that's causing our code to be more complex than it needs to be? And I think whenever I read that chapter, that always stands out to me, and I'm always wondering, how many developers in their lifetime, and this question is for you, how many times have you been writing some code, building a system, and thought to yourself, this code is too complex? Not because you haven't used some design pattern or not because you've taken a shortcut, but because your understanding of the domain isn't good enough, and that's causing the code to be complex. How often have you had that conversation in your team? For me, it doesn't happen very often. Don't really look at code and say, if I understood this domain better, that code could be much simpler. So just an interesting observation. So back to the story. Eric and his team, they're getting this, the feeling is grown a bit more now, and they're like, okay, we've got a basic design problem here, but we don't know what it is. So that's the first part. I think that part of the chapter is giving you some insights in what it's like to work with an experienced domain modeler or be an experienced domain modeler when you can see the code is more complex than it needs to be for the domain you're working in. That's the first thing, that intuition. In the second part of the chapter, I think it gets more about the value of using the domain to drive your software and practices around that. We start to see more of the benefits of this approach rather than just feelings. So suddenly, 1 week it dawned on us what was wrong. So they've identified the problem. Our model tied together the facility and loan shares in a way that was not appropriate for their business. So their model in code, the way they design those objects and the relationships between them, that there wasn't enough alignment between the way the code was structured and the way people in the business thought about those concepts and the relationships between them. So they've identified the part of the code and the part of the domain that they don't understand well enough. And so then they get to the whiteboard with some domain experts. They're like, that's the thinking process here, right? They're like, this code is too complex. They didn't think, let's have a TDD session on it and keep refactoring until it gets nicer. They were like, let's step away from the code. Let's get some domain experts and let's go to the whiteboard and understand the problem better before we come back to this basic design problem we found. So they walked through numerous scenarios using this new model they created. And I've highlighted the word scenarios here because I think that's really important when trying to understand the domain and create models. So it's very easy to fool yourself when you stay high level, thinking you understand something, especially at a domain. It's easy to think, oh, we understand the happy path. But actually, once you get into it and you start implementing code, sometimes you're like, oh, what should happen here? Either you stop working and try and get some clarification, or you make an assumption. I'll just throw an exception. That'll be fine. Never happens. Whereas when you go through concrete scenarios, you can't make assumptions about how things work. It's there. It's very specific. So Eric created this model exploration whirlpool, which is a good approach for anyone, I think, especially beginners, to think about how to create a domain model, how to make sure that you're balancing knowledge of the domain with the code itself. And he was talking about those feelings. This is a way to address those feelings, to go through some concrete scenarios. And here's a technique which wasn't around when the book was written, but it's a technique I found very useful, which is called example mapping. Basically, there's a few different ways you can do this. Let me give you an example of one time I did it. So I worked with an Austrian company. The code base was in German, very difficult. But basically, that wasn't the problem. The problem was the team would be given some requirements and a deadline. And the team kept getting unexpected requirements, or they kept finding unexpected use cases, and the team never hit their deadline. On another situation, we had these vague requirements, and we spent 2 weeks trying to implement like one feature. It was like we tried it, like that doesn't seem to make sense, it doesn't work. We go back to the domain experts, and they would say, oh yeah, when that happens, when the truck's late, then you have to trigger this workflow. And basically, we spent 2 weeks hitting our head against the wall trying to understand this domain, whereas if we would have done 1 hour of example mapping, we would have understood that we could have gone through very specific concrete details. So example mapping, you can do it in different ways, but in this example here, we have an action a user wants to perform, and then we have different scenarios and the events that happen in each of those scenarios. So in this example, we've got a shopper requests a refund. If it's 2 to 3 weeks after the purchase, vouchers are offered. That's the domain events. If it's less than 2 weeks, the shopper gets refunded. So it's actually a very simple technique. But when you take some requirements, some obvious requirements like just implementing a new feature, and you do example mapping, and you let your developers and testers go crazy on it, they'll find all kinds of edge cases and use cases you weren't thinking about before. It's getting really into the domain, understanding it much better. And with the Austrian company I was talking about, we solved that problem of everything being delivered late on time by we did example mapping for 1 hour in the sprint before. So if in sprint 1, we'll do some example mapping on the work we're going to do in sprint 2. We found all of these extra edge cases, understood the domain much better, and we went back to the business and said, we found all these edge cases, what should happen? Should we build this one? Should we ignore this one? And sometimes it was like, yeah, we'll take that, not that, don't worry about that. And sometimes it was like, wow, this part of the domain is much more complex than we realized. We're going to take the whole feature back, think about that some more. So that's why I think the model exploration whirlpool, focusing on scenarios, that's basically 90% of my job. But let's just talk through some concrete scenarios, such as, if I was going to write a clickbait title, one simple trick to create better domain models, talk through concrete scenarios. But that's boring. So in the book, here's Eric doing this. He's going through a concrete scenario with his domain experts. Diagram says that a borrower has chosen to draw an initial 50 million from the 100 million committed, and there are 3 lenders. So talking about very concrete details here. In reality, once we've done this, once we plug in those concrete values to make it specific, we can say, what if there were 5 lenders? What if it was 20 million? And we can start to see all these different variations. But if we stay too high level, we miss all that complexity. That's why it's important for scenarios. Anyway, back to the story. We had 2 deep insights. After these whiteboard sessions, we had 2 deep insights. First was the realization that our investments and loan investments were just 2 special cases of a general and fundamental concept: shares. Shares of a facility, shares of a loan, shares of a payment distribution. Don't worry too much about all those details. Don't worry about learning that domain or anything. But the key point is, they've spent some time with the domain experts going through concrete scenarios, being very specific with numbers and filling in all the details, and they found this hidden concept in their domain of shares. Now is their big moment of breakthrough. Suddenly, on the basis of this new way of looking at the domain, we could run through every scenario we had ever encountered relatively effortlessly, much more simply than ever before. So that's the real value of good modeling. All those awkward edge cases that were difficult to implement, making the code complex. By spending some time with domain experts, understanding the problem better, they were actually able to create a model which made things much easier. But there's a twist coming up in a minute, so I want to quickly emphasize the concept of breakthroughs. So what we just saw, they had a breakthrough in their domain knowledge, and that led to a breakthrough in the software, this concept of shares, understanding the business better, allowed them to create a very different model, and all of the concepts and relationships and adding new features, it was all working much better, much more easier to adapt. That's why breakthroughs are important. Even if you work with your domain experts around the whiteboard and you learn something about the domain, but it's not changing your view much, if you keep doing that, at some point, you'll get to a big breakthrough that'll have a big impact on your code. So you've got to keep going at that, keep working at it. If it feels like you have a 1-hour workshop with some domain experts and you're like, yeah, I learned a bit, but not too much, you've got to keep going, just keep at it, keep learning more. And you might get to a big breakthrough like shares. And when you do that, when you can create the better model, improve your understanding, because your model matches the way the business talk about these concepts, it's going to be much easier to translate the conversation with domain experts into the code. So it has a number of benefits. It just keeps on getting better. So here's the twist in the tale. So Eric and his team, they found this nice new model. It worked all really well, and they felt sick because, like every project, they had an urgent deadline coming up, and they didn't actually have the time to refactor their code. So what's going to happen in the final part of this story? If my nerves will just not get any worse for the next 10 minutes, you will find out. So in this part, I think it's characterized by investment. In part 2, we saw the value of being domain-driven, working with domain experts, getting more knowledge. We saw the benefits there of this improved model. In this part, moving more into design and code, how it can pay off in the long term. So at the final part of the chapter, he talks about the gospel of refactoring is that you always go in small steps. and everything keeps working. If anything, if you take a small step and it doesn't work, just do a git revert, go back, take another small step. But this is the real world, where things don't always go to plan, where things that you see at conferences and read in blog posts, that perfect world meets reality. So what happened is, to refactor our code to this new model would require a lot of supporting code, but there would be few, if any, stable stopping points in between. So he's got this old model. They spent 4 months over winter creating this beautiful model, which they were happy with, and now they're like, that old thing, we need to get rid of it completely and have this nice new model. But we'll let them off. But it's just the point that in reality, we talk about small steps, small refactorings. But in this situation, that wasn't possible. So here's one of the most, I would probably say, possibly the most interesting parts of this whole chapter. So Eric, he goes to his project manager and he's saying, look, we need to refactor this code, but we've got this urgent deadline coming up. And I don't know what Eric said to that project manager, but the project manager's like, don't worry, dudes, I'll handle the heat. You do the refactoring, and I'll block any problems coming your way. And he says, he's always had tremendous admiration for the courage and trust it took the project manager to make that decision. And that, for me, is another interesting stopping point, another interrogation point in this chapter. So firstly, what would you have done in his situation? If you think, oh, we can create a much nicer model, but it's risking this deadline, which is already late. But you believe that this model will make things much easier in the long run. Would people in your team, would you have the courage to do that, to say that to your project manager or product manager or whoever needs that decision? Or maybe you don't need to make that question. Maybe your team is empowered to make those decisions by yourself. And I guess looking more retrospectively, have you done that? Have you ever delayed a business deliverable to refactor your code and make it better in a modeling sense, in a domain modeling sense? And I think the third part here is the most interesting. Not have you done that, would you have been able to do that? Do you have a good relationship with your domain experts, project managers, product managers, that if you needed some time to improve the quality of your system to create a better model, could you even have that conversation? Do you have a good relationship with those people? Like Eric and his project manager had a great reputation there. I can think back in my career where I probably wouldn't even have been able to ask that question because I just didn't have a good relationship. So there's a point here that if you want to create great software, the relationships do matter, and this gives us a good example of that. So then, what happens next in the chapter is they refactor the code, the project manager lets them do it, everything goes nice and happy, otherwise he probably wouldn't have written about it. But they discovered this new concept now. They uncovered this domain concept of shares, and now Eric and his team, they uncovered this new concept called the share pie. And this share pie, he says here, became the unifying theme of the whole application. And they used it to discuss the system. Domain experts, business experts, and engineers, developers. This share pie concept was part of their modeling code, and it became the way they spoke about the whole system, even when they weren't talking about the code. And it says here, even the marketing people used it to explain the features to prospective customers. So, this journey they went on from, I feel like this code's a bit too complex. Let's try and understand the domain better. Now they've got this new concept that's spread out all the way to marketing. That was the pause where I was supposed to make a joke about marketing, but I thought I wouldn't today. But I do want to emphasize, which I think is not appreciated enough sometimes, that we talk about domain-driven. Yes, the domain should drive our code, but I also think it works the other way. And I think people don't realize this enough. Rather than just looking in the domain for concepts in your code, sometimes you need to actually add new concepts to the domain. That's what they did here. They added this concept of a share pie. It's not a one-way relationship. And if you see that as a developer, if you think, it's not I'm not taking requirements and implementing them into a good model, but I can actually go into the domain, add some new concepts and change things. They added SharePie, that became a part of their system. The marketing team used it, they changed the domain. When they were implementing it, they found a better model in software, and that model in software was actually a better conceptual model for the domain itself. So, I think it's really important to have that two-way approach. What else is in here? Yeah, cover that. And I think since the domain-driven design book has been written, the way we build software, the modern product management has also arrived at the same solution. A lot of people, a lot of product consultants like Marty Kagan, Melissa Perry. If you're a developer, I would recommend going to some product conferences like Mind the Product. And they're all talking about like this whole team innovation, about the product manager is just a facilitator. And it's the engineers, the testers, who actually come up with a lot of product ideas and solutions. I think that's what Eric was getting at in that chapter with the SharePie. Like, they were not just implementing the requirements, but they were shaping the product itself. So I think that's another interesting thing. I think these concepts have become more mainstream, and they're talking about these concepts at product management conferences, but it's not something I see in every company. So my question to you is, when was the last time like someone in your team came up with a product feature? When was the last time your team, I'm talking like engineers or testers, when was the last time you came up with this like SharePie, whatever SharePie is in your company? When was the last time that happened? And if it's not happening, maybe that's something to think about. Maybe that's something you could be doing more of, getting your team more involved in the product itself, more into the domain, more identifying opportunities, solutions, and new features. So, getting to the end now, just going to finish off this chapter. So, just weeks after the release of the SharePie version of the software, they noticed another awkward aspect of their model that was complicating their design. So, if you think about the evolution, they inherited the code base, they refactored it over winter in New York with a nice model. They then threw that model away and built the new SharePie model, and now they're seeing again, oh, actually, this design we thought was perfect isn't perfect. There's a whole area over here that can be improved. Again, with their improvements in domain knowledge, and I think that's important. Like, if you keep making those steps, if you keep learning more about the domain and updating your model, you might realize, oh, we're almost at the top of Mount Everest. This model can't be any better. But really, you might be like not even halfway up. There might be like so much more about the domain you can learn to improve your code. So, every time you make a breakthrough, it helps you to see the other bits of your knowledge and your model that weren't as good as you thought they were before that. And then the final part of the chapter, this concept of investment, basically, after improving their model, it was actually easier for them to add new features. They were adding new features faster than they were at the start of the project. So I think, as a bit of a choose your adventure scenario here, at the start of a project, it's always easy to add new features. The code base is clean, there's no legacy, you've got a nice F1 car, really quick to get stuff done, adding a text box to a web page, 20 minutes, deployed to production, amazing. But over time, code gets more complex, harder to work with, things take longer, everyone gets a bit stressed out, deadlines being missed, that Formula One car is turned into an old banger, no one likes it anymore, everyone wants to work on a nice new code base. But actually, that is not inevitable. There's a choice here. Because the more you work on a system, the more you learn about the domain. And really, if you think about that, that should make you go faster, right? The more you understand the business, you'll be able to add new features faster. So if you continue to gain domain knowledge and reflect that in your systems, you might go from an F1 car to a spaceship where things go even faster. So I'm going to quickly wrap things up now. Firstly, during the pandemic, there were no in-person conferences, so a bunch of us decided to spend our time in a useful way. We created this GitHub account called DDD Crew. Great place to start. Practical techniques, things you can apply, how to like combine event storming, example mapping, all these different kind of techniques. Definitely recommend that if you're at the start of your journey and you want to bring more collaborative design into your team, get closer to domain experts. And then I've got 4 quick takeaways I'd like to recap just to make sure I get the key points across. But you might have different takeaways. If you do, that's totally fine. The first one I would say is going back to that feeling that they were having about something's not right here. If changing your code is hard, if adding these new unexpected requirements is difficult, it might not be that your code is bad. You might follow all of the principles, solid, Cupids, whatever patterns and principles you follow. You might be doing all of those things well, but it might be your understanding of the domain that's not at the level you need to improve your code. Second one is about the relationship between you and the domain. Yeah, the domain drives your code, but also you can drive the domain. You can add new concepts. Try and find the share pie in your domain. What's a concept that would make your code better, and it would change your domain in a positive way? Also an investment, think about that decision with the project manager. He's like, I should make a meme about this, like one face happy, one face sad or something. Didn't think of that, but you've got like refactor the code over here and a deadline over here, like which one do you go? For them, the investment was worth it. So, it's thinking about domain modeling as an investment. Third point is, the fourth point is my friends at the Church of DDD. If you think about this chapter, to me, it's the hidden treasure because in this chapter, he doesn't talk about any of that stuff. He doesn't talk about bounded context, ubiquitous language. He doesn't talk about any of that stuff. It's just the story of him and his team solving some problems in a logical way, working with the domain experts, emphasizing the problems we face on real projects. So I think you can get all of these benefits, even if you don't do domain-driven design by the book and use all the terminology. I still think these concepts are more useful. So I'm going to leave you with 3 questions to think about. What would your alternative timeline be? What would you change about domain-driven design? Could be if you could do anything. If you want to send me your thoughts afterwards, please do that. If you can beat reducing the whole book to 1 chapter, I'll be impressed. But maybe I'm only halfway up Mount Everest and there's still loads more improvement possible. And also just thinking about right now, like which bit of the talk today is still there with you the most? Maybe you're bored and not thinking about this talk, but if you are thinking about this talk, which bit of it stands out to you the most? And then take that feeling and think about, why is that standing out to you? Maybe it's something you don't do enough of, or maybe it's something you recognize, or just think about what you can do with that after this talk. See if that's something you should spend more time thinking about. Maybe it's the part about your team being more involved in designing the product itself. Whatever stands out to you, try and follow that up, see if it can be something useful. And so, just as my nerves are starting to go away, we have reached the end of this talk, and you're now back in the original DDD timeline. Thank you.